Welcome back to the Intermediate and Advanced Spring track. I hope you are enjoying all the great content so far. If you're building production applications, then you know that security is an integral concern in your application design. Eleftheria Stein is joining us today to present on test-driven security. Welcome, Ria. I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Roy. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you all. Well, hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to Spring One. Here in Germany, it's 4:35 p.m., which is a great time to talk about test-driven security. I'm Ria. I'm a committer on the Spring Security team, and before joining this team, I worked as a consultant helping teams build applications in an agile way. Today, we're going to be talking about one of those agile practices, which is test-driven development. And we're going to be talking about it in the context of how you can test drive the security of your application. I'll start off with a quick disclaimer in case I mention anything that's still under development. And the agenda for today. We're going to start off by catching everyone up to speed on what test-driven development is. We'll then start writing some tests and introduce the Spring Security test support. We'll write some tests in our application testing for broken access control, as well as broken authentication. And then finally, I'll suggest some ways that you might be able to get started with test driving security in your project. There will be 15 minutes of Q&A at the end, but it won't be in this screen here. There will be a separate Zoom meeting for you to join, and you can find that link in the Spring One Slack. So if you're interested in joining the Q&A, make sure you're on the Slack channel. Let's start with the definition of test-driven development. Test-driven development is a technique for building software where feature development is guided by writing tests. So what we're going to do is first write a test for the feature that we want to add. The test will initially fail since we haven't written any production code yet. We'll then write the minimal amount of code necessary to make this test pass. And once the test passes, we'll do any refactoring that's necessary. Then we can move on to the next test for the next feature that we want to add. Let's see this in practice. Throughout this session, we're going to be building a conference application. So it's going to have various features that you might expect from a conference website. We're going to write this first test slowly to make sure everyone can follow along. And after that, we'll speed it up a little bit. The first endpoint that we're going to create is an endpoint called about, and it's going to return some basic information about the conference. So let's start by writing a test for that. We can call it about returns conference info. We are going to perform a GET request to the about endpoint, and we'll start off by expecting that the status is OK. I'm going to run this test now. And since I don't have any code in my controller yet, we're going to see this fail. And indeed, here we can see that it failed. And the reason why it failed is because it expected a 200 status, but it actually got a 404 not found since the endpoint doesn't exist. Let's come to our controller now and write the minimal code necessary in order to make this test pass. We'll create a get mapping for about. And for now, this endpoint is not going to do anything other than exist, since that is the minimal amount of code that's necessary to make this test pass. Running it again, we will expect that the test will now pass. And it does. Now, if we look at the functionality we have so far, it's not providing much value to our user by simply having an endpoint that exists. So we'll add an additional assertion here, saying that we also expect this endpoint to return the content with the string that says, join us online September 1st to 2nd. We will run this test again, knowing that it's going to fail. And then we can come to our controller and add some additional code to make the test pass again. Now we'll run our test once again. And now we have a green test. Since I've added such minimal code, I don't think there's a need to refactor. So I'm going to move on to the next test. From here on out, I might be skipping a couple of steps just for the sake of not boring you and getting everything we need to get done in the time that we have. So this endpoint that we've added so far and this test doesn't have anything to do with security because our application isn't secured yet. In the next endpoint that we're going to add, we're going to introduce the concept of a user. The endpoint that we're adding now is going to be called greeting, and it's going to greet the user according to what their username is. So if the user has the username Ria, it's going to return hello Ria. Let's start off with a test for that. Initially, we're calling the greeting endpoint. We're expecting that the status is okay. And we're also going to expect that the content this returns is the string hello Ria. In order to simulate making this request as a user with a username Ria, we're going to need some help from the Spring Security test support. So let's come to, sorry, is there something wrong? Okay, sorry about that. So we'll come to the build.gradle here, and we will add our dependencies. We're first going to add the security dependency, which is Spring Boot Starter Security. And then we can add the security test dependency, which is Spring Security Test. And this is going to provide us with the functionality that's necessary in order to simulate making that request as a certain user. So now that we have this, we can come here to our greeting request and say we're making this request with a user that has the username Ria. Now this user method here is provided by the Spring Security test support, and it is a post processor that will associate this user that we've created here with this GET request that we're making. This also comes with some additional defaults like a password and some authorities, but for now, all we care about overriding is the username. One other thing that we need to do is configure mock MVC to work with Spring Security. So here I'm going to come and apply Spring Security. We'll now run this test. And once again, this test is expected to fail since we don't have the appropriate code to make it pass. Now that we've seen this test fail, we can come to our controller and add the code for our greeting endpoint. We've created a get mapping for greeting, and here we're going to need to get the username of the authenticated user. To do that, we can use the authentication principal annotation, which will get the principal, and we can supply an expression which will extract the username from it in order to get the user's username. Once we have that, we can use that down here in our response body to greet the user with their username. We can then run our test again. And we see that it's green. Now, one of the purposes of writing tests is to make sure that as we add new functionality, we're not breaking any of our existing functionality. But in fact, in this case, if I rerun the test suite, we'll see that I have broken the functionality for the about endpoint. And looking here at the test failure, we see that it expected a 200 response, but it in fact received a 401 unauthorized. The reason for that is because we added the Spring Security dependency. As soon as you add that dependency, by default, all the endpoints will require an authenticated user in order to access them. And here in our test, we're not providing an authenticated user. And in fact, we don't want to because this about endpoint will be accessible to everyone. To customize that, we can come to our security configuration here. We'll first annotate this with enable web security. And then here I am going to create a security filter chain bean. If you've used Spring Security before, you may have extended the web security configure adapter and configured HTTP security by doing that. You can now simply inject HTTP security and expose a security filter chain bean rather than having to extend that adapter. And here we're saying that we want to use HTTP basic in this application. And we're also saying that for any request, all users are permitted to access it. Let's run our test suite again. Now we have 2 green tests. We talked about the access control for the about endpoint and the fact that everyone should be able to access it, but we haven't written any tests for the access control of the greeting endpoint. So let's consider who should have access to the greeting endpoint. Since we are using the username to greet our users, we're going to require the user to be authenticated so that we can use the proper username to greet them. The next thing that we're going to do is add a test checking what happens when an unauthenticated user tries to access the greeting endpoint. And in this case, we will expect that the user will get a 401 unauthorized. Let's run this test. And once again, our test fails. If we come to our security configuration, we see that for any request, all users are permitted to access it. So we're not restricting the users that are allowed to access the greeting endpoint. We can change that by saying that if a request matches the about endpoint, then it's permitted to everyone. But for any other request, we're going to require the user to be authenticated. Now let's run our test again, and this should be enough to make our test pass. So far in our test, we've been able to leverage the default user that comes with Spring Security. But let's consider a more complex case where we might want to have some additional attributes associated with our user. So I'm just going to explain what I've done so far rather than writing out the code, just in order to save some time. So we have created a submissions endpoint. And in order to do this, we've had to introduce a custom user. So here we can see a class, not here, apologies. In our conference user class, we can see a class called conference user. And this user has a username, a password, and a list of submissions. These are the talks that they've submitted to the conference. There's also a Boolean about whether this user is a speaker and whether this user is an admin. Then here in our conference user service, we've created a class called conference user details that both extends the conference user and also implements the user details interface. The benefit of this is that when you're using this object in your business logic, you can treat it as a conference user, while when you're using it in Spring Security, you can treat it as a user details. Coming back to our test now, we have a test for the happy path of submissions. We have created a conference user here called Joe, and Joe has one submission called Getting Started with Spring Authorization Server, and we've set speaker to be true. We're then simulating making the request to submissions with the user Joe using the conference user details class here. And I'll just point out that this user post processor will accept a string as a username, but you can also provide it an instance of user details as we've done here. We're then checking the status, and we're checking that the size of the list that is returned is 1, and we're checking that it has the single object that we expect. Now we've also added an endpoint for when the user is not a speaker. Here we've explicitly set that this user only has the role attendee, and we expect that the status is going to be a 403 forbidden. And then we also have a test for what happens when an unauthenticated user tries to access the submissions endpoint. And if you were able to catch what we did with the greetings endpoint, we also expected that we would return a 401 unauthorized to an unauthenticated user. In our security config, we've added a matcher for the submissions endpoint, saying that the user has to have the role speaker in order to access the submissions endpoint. And then in our controller, we've added the endpoint. And once again, we're using the authentication principal annotation, but this time rather than using an expression, we are getting the entire conference user object and returning the list of submissions. Let's quickly run these tests, and then we'll be all caught up to speed and we can continue with writing some more tests. Okay, looks like these tests are all passing. Now, so far we've talked about testing our business logic. We've tested for broken access control. We're also going to look at one more type of test, which is testing for broken authentication. And for that, we're going to add an additional endpoint that will allow admin users to update the about information. So the information that we are returning here from the about endpoint, we're going to allow admin users to update that by performing a post to the about endpoint. So let's write a test for that. And we'll start off with just the first request here. We're saying that we're going to perform a post to about. We're going to send the content, join us online September 11th, 12th. So we've changed the date here, and we're saying that this user is an admin. Now, if I run this test, I will expect it to fail because I haven't created a post for the about endpoint. And I will expect it to fail with a 404 like we've seen before, or in fact, a 405 in this case, because we do have a get mapping for the about endpoint, and 405 means method not allowed. So if we're trying to make a post request, we should expect the 405. Now, when we look at why it actually failed, we see that it failed with a 403 status, and that means forbidden. It's not the expected 405. The reason for that is because we're making a post request here, and by default, post requests are protected against cross-site request forgery. In order to make this test pass, and in order to reach our controller, we're going to need to provide a valid CSRF token. And we can do that in our test using this CSRF post processor. If you're not familiar with what cross-site request forgery is, you can read about it in the Spring Security reference documentation, and I'll have a link to that later on. So now if I run this test, I'll still expect it to fail, but I'll expect it to fail with a 405 this time. And indeed, we can now see that it expected a 200, but it got a 405. I'm going to uncomment this section, and we can now come to our controller and implement the necessary code to make this test pass. I'm going to do a bit of an update here, and I'm going to create a variable called about conference. And if you perform a get mapping to about, you will get this variable back. And if you post to about, then you can update this variable. So I can now run this test. And this time it'll be successful. Now coming to my tests over here, since I have a test for what happens when I provide a valid CSRF token, I should also have a test checking what happens when I don't provide a valid CSRF token. That's going to be very similar to this test here, with a few differences, of course. So we're going to post to the about endpoint with no CSRF token. And then we're going to expect that we're getting a 403 forbidden. So I've removed the CSRF post processor, and I'm going to expect that the status is a 403 forbidden. Now, if I run this test, I'll see that it passes, but I don't have much confidence in a test that I always see passing. I want to know that it's going to fail under the right circumstances. So I'm going to come here and temporarily disable CSRF protection just for long enough to see that if someone came and did this, this test would catch that mistake and fail. And indeed, this test does fail now, and I have more confidence in it. I'll get rid of that disable CSRF, and we'll come back here. And we're missing two final tests, which are what happens when a user who's not an admin tries to access the post to the about endpoint, and what happens when a user who's unauthenticated tries to post to the about endpoint. So let's add those two tests. That's those tests down here. And if I run my test suite again, we'll see that the two newest tests that I added are going to fail. We can see the reason why in the security config here, because I've said for any endpoint that matches about, anyone is permitted to access it. In order to make this do what I actually want, I'm going to say that if you're performing a GET request to the about endpoint, then anyone is permitted to access it. Meanwhile, if you're performing a POST request, then you have to have the role admin. Let's run our tests one final time. And we're slowly seeing all of them turn green. So we have 10 out of 10 tests passing. This is all the functionality I wanted to add to the application today. It is a well-tested conference application, although I don't expect that the Spring One organizers will be having me write their conference website anytime soon. Let's come back to the slides for one final topic that I wanted to mention, and that's how you can get started with doing security tests in your project. One strategy that I've seen work successfully in the past is using a pen testing report as a starting point, if that's something that's available to you. If your organization does pen testing, you'll likely have received a report with a number of tests that have been run against your application and the expected outputs. If you go through that report, you can see which tests you might be able to automate within your test suite. Another approach is to check out this OWASP security testing guide for web applications. This also has step-by-step instructions describing how to test for certain vulnerabilities in your application. So again, you can go through those steps and see what you can automate. Finally, I'll just share some references. The first one is the Spring Security testing section of the reference documentation. And the second one is the code from today with one commit for every endpoint that we added and the associated tests. So if you missed something, which you probably did because of the technical issues, you can check out the commits that are in that repository. Finally, I'll just thank you for spending your time here today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. I'm going to see you in the Q&A section.
Thank you, Ria. Understanding how to more easily test our security configuration is critical for properly securing and validating our production applications. Thanks for providing some clear examples. For our audience, I realize we had a few short technical issues. If you'd like to follow up with Ria about any additional questions or comments, please join her in the Q&A session. Up next, we have Rasen Stoyanchev and Andreas Merrick, who will present on Spring GraphQL.